Is that me?
Yes.
Can people see me? Is that too dark? Is that too bright?
It's a bit.
Hang on.
Can you maybe wipe the camera because it gets all those lights when it's on white. Oh yeah, that's better. Welcome, Paul.
Okay, welcome. How you doing?
Great. Better with every speaker.
That's great. That's great. Let me get the time. So, give me an idea of my time.
Oh, it's 30 minutes for the talk and 10 for the Q&A, but
okay.
we are a bit off the timing, so okay. Yeah, just don't forget to enjoy yourself.
All right, thanks, Artem. This is great. Listen, okay. I've tried to get into some of the earlier sessions, so I've just come back from a conference. So welcome everybody. It's great to be here again. I don't know, is this your second or third conference, Artem? You've done this before? Fourth. Oh my goodness. So they get better and better, and I can see the number of people participating. It's great. So listen, I've only got half an hour. So listen, I don't want to. And after Jill and Jean, sort of wonderful, softening, inspiring, repairing relationships and the work of narrative healing. I mean, I really think that's so important, so special. So I kind of don't want to rain on that parade, so to speak.
But I know you're not going to ruin it.
No.
So I'm just going to jump off the air and give you your slides. Okay.
Okay, sure. So listen, so just for people who I haven't met and I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, or old colleagues who not colleagues that I know, I'm an Australian. I work in Washington D.C. I'm an international educator. I studied with Michael White back in the 90s, and have a long history and run what's known as storywise.com or the Center for Narrative Studies. So and I'm looking at this audience and just seeing, I can see some very familiar faces of very practiced practitioners of the narrative method. And I see some people who are, Artem's Circle, which is an amazing international circle of people everywhere, and people wanting to learn more. And also there may be some people who are new, that have never really dabbled in this story business before, and are kind of interested and intrigued. And I think that there's a lot, my goodness, there's a lot on offer here that I've already sort of sampled. And this circle of story practitioners is international, pretty well known. We know each other, or we know each other's works. But I guess just given that I haven't got a lot of time, I want to tell you what I want to tell you at the very start. The story about story and a call for a rethink is, if you're looking at genres, when we think about a fairy tale or an adventure story or a detective story, we talk about genres. So what's the genre of my talk? I think the genre of my talk is like a cautionary tale, if you know what that word means, what that genre is. You tell your kids, if you see a stranger on the street, especially if they ask you to jump in the car, do not do that. Because when I was a little kid, there was, my best friend was walking on the street one day and blah, blah, blah. Or, you're going to go into the water to have a swim. Well, don't go out beyond the flags because, that's dangerous. Let me tell you what happened to my mother when she was swimming. A cautionary tale is kind of like a little, just be a little bit of a warning. Or another way of thinking about it is, I run a local AmeriCorps program here, which is a volunteer program, and we had a gathering of all the programs of the state one year, and we heard somebody who was in the environmental corps, and they were telling us about their adventures with a chainsaw, and they were working in the forest, trying to keep the forest protected, but sometimes there's dead trees and you have to chop down the branches, or even the tree is dead. And he was telling us how he had to learn how to use the chainsaw and how he almost killed himself using the chainsaw because he hadn't been taught properly. So I guess in this conversation about stories, I feel like I'm the safety officer. Like we're getting taught about a very powerful instrument, a very powerful tool, and I'm like the safety officer who's saying, "Hang on, just be careful, just be careful." When I want to change the slides, Tim, what do? Do I just, is there a button to push, or I just push the button on the, oh yes, I do. Okay, there we are, back. All right, so there, I have my own button on the computer. So I want to sort of challenge a little bit the story we have about story that says that it's always, we want it to work for good, and we do, but sometimes it works for the opposite. Sometimes it works for bad, and that we better sort of not just get too optimistic in a way, or too romanticized, or too naive, or too innocent. So let's just go through quickly the slides in terms of, but before we start, the other thing is I will leave you with this challenge. I think failure is a much better story than success. And so why don't we share our stories of our failures? If Shakespeare decided not to write any plays about failure, how many plays would we have left? Hamlet would go, Othello would go, Cleopatra would go. Most of Shakespeare's work would not, we wouldn't be talking about it. So sometimes I think our addiction to story, maybe our addiction to success stories, it sometimes gets in the way of allowing a bigger reality to come in and sometimes challenge our work. And I want to tell you how it's challenged my work. So here we are, stories without borders, building bridges, but stories create borders and they create divisions, and stories demolish bridges. I think of that beautiful bridge, was it in Mostar, in the Balkan War, the years and years ago, and blown up, the mosque and the bridge, that beautiful, beautiful bridge, blown up by military action. And because someone had a story to say that that bridge was a threat, that bridge was a danger. So we shouldn't just think that stories can not only just build bridges and get beyond borders, or some stories do get beyond borders, like the terrorist story goes beyond borders. So let's kind of take that into the compass of our world. But the way I want to just quickly review this is, look, I want to not just talk about you. I want to share my own sort of journey about coming from being, one of the most staunch story evangelists to kind of now being a little bit of a story skeptic. I've worked building bridges and expanding borders in international settings. Ireland, Northern Ireland, with the Washington Island program, and you can Google that. The work in South Africa, work in Israel, Palestine, and Noah Baum is coming after me as one of my wonderful friends and one of the teachers in that program. And then I do a program here locally in the local school system using stories. So I just kind of think if you just work with yourself, and as I'm doing with me, to do an account, a report card on sort of your own work in the last 5, 10 years, what would your report card look like? To give ourselves, that word being accountable means being able to give an account, being able to tell a story about the work that we've done. So, in the Irish work, Catholic, Protestant, Northern Ireland, we run programs which brings these young leaders to Washington. They live together, Catholic, Protestant, in the same host family. They work together on the Hill with a congressman who has a Catholic and a Protestant. They're in their 20s. And they have a shared experience, which we hope is going to be the prologue to a new story of possibility. So in terms of Northern Ireland, and it wasn't just our little program, which is still going strong, but the Good Friday Agreement, George Mitchell, President Clinton, an amazing array of people all on the same side, all telling the same story of possibility for Northern Ireland after 30 years of trouble. So in terms of the work that we did there, we give ourselves an A or even an A+. The current Taoiseach, Leah Varadkar, the Prime Minister of Ireland, is one of the graduates of our program and a friend and stuff. In South Africa, well, the program we had there worked for 10 years and then shut down because of needs in South Africa, and it sort of worked. But we give ourselves a B because we didn't carry it. It wasn't able to be carried through. But then the last one, we got very courageous, and Noah Baum was one of the people helping us start an Israel-Palestine program. And last week in Gaza there was bombing, and there was a death in Israel. There were 20 or 30 deaths in Gaza. the Israeli government is under siege because of protests and the question of democracy. The US government continues to give sort of this massive aid to Israel and really is kind of a little bit constrained about holding them to account. So I've been doing this for 10 years, same idea. Israeli, Palestinian young leaders come to Washington, work on the Hill, live together in the same family, and hopefully start a new story. It's called New Story Leadership. But, well, you know what? I give myself, so far, an E, a failure. But you know, it was a similar kind of model of story change that we tried successfully in Ireland, that we tried in South Africa. And then, but then look, we needed the forces that be to support us. And President Obama had, you know, Mitchell and Kerry on the job. President Trump had his son-in-law. President Biden's really, there's no political mileage in doing anything. So, you know, the situation that we worked in had gone from disastrous to catastrophic. So if I was here to tell you that the work was brilliant or tell you a success story, I'd be lying. I mean, sometimes story doesn't work. Sometimes the story change model just there's too many things working against it, or there's another story that disqualifies it. So this new story of Israeli and Palestinians being together, working together, having a shared future together, it has no audience at the moment. It gets choked before it has any chance to breathe. And the delegates who participate each year, and it's still going strong, have to risk their lives. And we can't put their stories even up on a website anymore because it's too dangerous. They get death threats, whether they're Israelis or whether they're Palestinians. So it's just to say, okay, that means failure has this funny thing about saying, you know, let's stop. Let's slow down. Let's take a deep breath and let's examine ourselves. Like, you know, we can blame everybody else for what's not working, but what are we doing here? Are we part of the problem or the solution? What is our role? And so, you know, this has been the soul searching that I've been through in the last 2 or 3 years with this kind of program, a story change program about what are we missing. And maybe, you know, you could think of your own work and some of the things that haven't worked in your own projects, as to asking yourself the same question. What were we missing? What was changed that we didn't understand or recognize? What were our blind spots? Now, for us, it was like, what story about the Middle East are we? Maybe we're trapped in some stories here that we don't even see. There's a reality out there that's not being storied or heard or listened to. So, like, you know, the two-state solution is sort of almost a cliche that everyone says, two-state solution. Secretary Blinken, President Biden. Well, but it's virtually a one-state right now. We thought Israel was committed to democracy. Hello, look what's happening in Israel now. Maybe that was an assumption we need to re-examine. We thought negotiation was possible if the sides were sort of basically equal, but like they were never equal. And then we're thinking end the occupation as if that's the magical solution. Well, maybe it doesn't really end a lot of things that are going on over there. So there are certain stories about the story we're trying to create that maybe instead of being our drive and our inspiration, maybe our prison. What stories are you trapped in terms of the limit that limits your work? So what story about change, we ask ourselves, has to change? Maybe we've got a model of change that is kind of a little bit old-fashioned. We say in this program, change the story, change the world. But sometimes the world has got to change maybe before the story changes. Maybe we have to rethink what change looks like and what are the early indicators of change. Maybe we've got blinkers on in what we notice as change. And then what story about story do we need to change? Because we think we're doing good. We think we're on the side of the angels. But you look around, and I don't know about you, internationally, certainly in the United States, you know, there's a lot of questioning going on here, a lot of angst. Is story on our side anymore? Have its better angels fled to the other side? In other words, you know, is the frustration or the wall that we're hitting should ask us to sort of do a total rethink? One of my favorite quotes comes from Abraham Lincoln in 1862. He's just president at the end of his first year. He's lost every battle almost on the northern armies. And he's about to sign the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1st, 63. He sends a letter to Congress, and this is the things he writes. The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present. The occasion is piled high with difficulty, and we must rise with the occasion. As our case is new, we must think anew and act anew. We must disenthrall ourselves, and then we shall save our country. What I love about that quote is that Lincoln is about to sign the Emancipation Proclamation to free the slaves, but he's also recognizing that our minds can be in chains. This word disenthrall is a lovely, lovely word. To be enthralled by something is to be captured by it. So he's saying we've got to think anew and act anew, and we've got to liberate our minds, our assumptions, our thinking. So that's kind of always sort of a guide to me to sort of say, all right, if I'm, follow me here now in terms of just my own self-assessment. What have, I look back, I've been doing this for 25, 30 years or longer. So I just say, sometimes, you have some successes and everyone, you want to tell the world about your successes, but somehow I think sometimes our failures are even more interesting and they're more human and they invite more empathy and they invite more connection. So let me just do a little kind of, the Jesuits have this idea of consciousness awareness, not conscience, but consciousness. What was I thinking when I was thinking? And like some of the sort of like, the 7 deadly sins of storytelling or story practitioners. So just let me examine my own conscience here to say, blind spots here. The story I have about story probably needs to be a little bit more complicated. For example, I come, having done social work and ministry and everything else. It's like, oh my God, I can save the world. And I mean, I guess anyone under 30 who wants to do good probably can fall into this trap. I want to save the world. Well, I can't even save myself. So how can I save the world? And then maybe, we're always got to tell our success story in our resume. We don't put on our resume the 5 greatest failures of our last 10 years, but it's like, it gives us a very distorted picture to the world. It sets up sort of an envy. My goodness, you're so successful. We know that we are all human and success isn't necessarily anyone's destiny, but we have to market ourselves and we've got to make a living, right? So, I mean, that's the market. But I just wonder whether we're selling our story and not telling our story. Then there's kind of, the us and the them. Well, I've been doing this for 30 years and I know all about it. And you've only been doing it for 1 and you maybe have to learn or do an apprenticeship. There's a certain sort of, privileging of the old guard maybe that I'm part of. But, storytelling is 5,000 or more years old, 30,000 years old. Like, are we going to sort of franchise the ancient human wisdom? I'm Australian. The Aboriginal peoples have been telling stories for 30,000 years. Like maybe it's their copyright originally. And then, expertism, as I say, like this privatization of knowledge and saying, and certainly in Israel-Palestine, the work is, it's just incredible that so many people have worked at this so long and are making a success of selling books. And but the story they've got to tell is that things are worse than ever. So it's like the experts turn failure into success, at least to market their books. So to me, I have to ask myself, am I part of the problem or solution? And, am I complicit? And that stories have become weapons of hate, just as much as instruments of peace. I mean, our ex-president just recently got up and gave a town hall meeting and, it's like propagating so provocative and so divisive. But then I ask myself, well, hang on, why am I so shocked? Why am I so surprised? I mean, Machiavelli, Plato, You know, Lenin, Mao, they all knew about all this. I mean, where have I been? I mean, why did I think stories could only be instruments of good and signs of virtue? They're weapons of hate and violence. So, I mean, stories are the nuclear option. They certainly seem to be right now, blowing up the truth. So how do we know we know how stories work, all of us? How can we work together to prevent this abuse or protect people's freedoms and choices? It's like, and you think lies are stories too, so what are we to do? I mean, as a start, recognize the dangers of our art. You know, it's like that chainsaw. We're using a chainsaw. It's hugely powerful. But boy, be careful. I mean, you just think Enron, Theranos, Bernie Madoff, the Bay of Pigs and Vietnam War, the weapons of mass destruction, January 6th and the stolen election, so-called, George Santos, the member for New York in our American Congress, Pat Tillman, the great famous footballer who was killed in Afghanistan, and all because, and the story that was spread was that it was you know, an enemy action when it was friendly fire. I mean, the Pentagon, the government, the economy, Wall Street, the church. It's like we're swimming in a sea of stories, and I think somehow we're drowning a little bit. If stories are never innocent, then where does it leave me? Where does it leave us? And when truth doesn't work anymore, then it seems to me I feel called to the challenge as a story practitioner to develop a whole set of narrative literacy tools, or story-wise skills is what I call them, sort of to teach people how not to get conned, to teach people how to smell a story that's just being told for somebody else's interest and not their own, to somehow not get conned by who they vote for or who they send their money to or what they believe about immigrants or what they believe about gays, that there's a spinning of stories that's like an infection, a conspiracy theory. And it's all stories. They're all using the medium that we're well practiced in. So, so just to come to the sort of close on this, I kind of, the way the Storywise has worked, and it's we run the center for 30 years almost now, called storywise.com. You can look it up. And our little adage is shaping the stories that are shaping us. It's kind of reflecting back on oneself. And I always think people, they're story savvy people. Everyone can tell a story. Most people intuitively are story savvy. But then people work in story, they become story smart. PR firms, Pentagon, the political parties, they're story smart. They know how to use stories. They know how to find the dirt stories on your opponent, spread a story, spread a doubt, spread you know, some sort of theory or some sort of speculation about somebody. But then, I don't know, the call to be story wise are the people who recognize that they're handling explosive materials when it comes to stories, and that somehow we have to prepare accordingly, and we have to develop or use a narrative ethic, an ethical practice, a narratively ethical practice. So, you know, I'm just leaving questions, and we're getting close to my 30 minutes, but it just seemed to me, we're either part of the problem or we're part of the solution, and we shouldn't just presume that we're part of the solution. That might be a blind spot of my messianic sort of calling or mission. But the test is there's not just what I intend, but the measure of my impact. And if the world is only wanting to get success stories, then maybe we're addicted to the narrow, the thin slice of reality that a success story captures. And then maybe we need a little dose of Kafka or some of these other great writers who just kind of deal with the grimness of reality, don't always want to get us into a redemptive cycle. Because when you look at the way the world is, there's a lot of people that for them it's a fairy tale. Like, the refugees from Syria, what is the redemptive cycle for them? The immigrants on the border in Mexico, what is the redemptive cycle for them? Are we telling stories that are sort of, that are not really honoring the experience that people of human experience, that there's another story we should tell, or we should complicate our story about story. So just in conclusion, and maybe you could get some conversational questions, I think it's time for us as story practitioners or those beginning the trade to somehow get a little bit, someone at the conference yesterday in America was talking about align with reality. That's a new term. I never heard that before, but it's just like, you know, Shakespeare, Tolstoy, you know, the great writers, you know, the great writers are allowing a bigger, bigger slice of reality into the story that includes and embraces reality of failure, weakness, vulnerability. Maybe Jung would say what I am saying is to embrace our shadow. I don't know. But I do think that there's a narrative ethical practice which we have worked on over the years ourselves, but that's a whole other seminar. But just in conclusion, and I really would be interested in any comments and questions. You know, there's a famous French film writer called Louis Malle, whose films are just extraordinary. But one day he was interviewed and he said, you know, what I miss are my failures. Some of my most favorite films were total commercial failures, but they're my favorite films of all time. And he said, I'd love to have a film festival called My Favorite Flops. I mean, imagine us as story practitioners coming together for a celebration of failure. No one is allowed to boast of any success. Let it all hang out. What's frustrating us? Where did we go down a blind alley? Or it might be, you know, an appreciative inquiry into what failure has to teach. Because when you think about it, even hero, the word hero, we've turned it into success story, Horatio Alger story. But a hero is somebody is usually a character in a tragic story. The hero usually never wins, and that's part of the heroic sort of character. Or what about, you know, we've got to recruit new candidates for our program here, you know, in the next 4 or 6 weeks. And it was a seminar this week at the conference I was at, you know, strengths-based interviewing. And you just think, you know, what about a weakness-based inquiry? Because my members are working with the poor and the under-resourced. Sometimes I don't want to know what you're strong in. I want to know your weaknesses. I mean, boast about them. I mean, that probably sounds like St. Paul. Or it's kind of like countercultural. Everyone's writing books for the poor about how to be rich. And I don't know how many people are writing books for the rich to say how to be poor. I mean, it's just like there's a bigger slice of reality, and our story, if we touch back into Shakespeare and into Tolstoy and into the great Chekhov, I mean, the Russian, I think maybe the Russian sensibility gets this more than, say, the American sensibility does. And maybe then I'm preaching to the converted, because your whole Russian literary tradition is so deep in that regard. But the culture in which I live here in the United States is somehow, you know, the capitalism thing about profit and growth and speed. Somehow I think probably infects the way our story operation goes. And I think that, but just lastly, if anyone was interested in doing some more reading on this, I think it's starting to enter the zeitgeist. Peter Brooks wrote a book at the start of the story revolution in the 1990s called Reading for the Plot. And he wrote a book that was really instrumental and inspirational around getting us all turned on to stories. And he's written a book there last year called Seduced by Story. And his journey is a little bit like mine, thinking, oops, what the heck? The genie has got out of the bottle. What the hell have I done? And can I pull it back a little bit? It's the first chapter and the last 2 chapters are worth reading. The others are very deeply literary critical studies, I found hard to plow through. But Peter Brooks is kind of like, he's fallen off the horse. He's not drinking the Kool-Aid anymore. And then another one, Jonathan Gottschall. You probably all got the copy of The Storytelling Animal on your shelf, and it's a fantastic book. Well, he's written a book just this year. There it is, called The Story Paradox. And even Jonathan Gottschall, like me, the great promoter of story, has written this book saying, hold up, everybody. This is a mess. Look at this, how our love of storytelling builds societies and tears them down. So there are two books that if you wanted to sort of, if you see that I'm the only one singing in the choir, like the heretic choir, as Artem calls me, I'm getting a few more choristers in the choir singing a little bit of a warning, a little bit of an alarm, saying, hold it. We've got an election in America next year. There's an election in Turkey right now. There's like stories are being weaponized. And I don't know whether we can stand on the sideline or just continue to promote story as this wonderful tool of success and bonding and harmonizing and building bridges and so on, and not be blind to the fact that someone stole our fire. Someone's stolen our fire, and it's deadly for a lot of people. And maybe we need to move to the front line of sort of what's the inoculation? What is the vaccination we can offer to people so they don't get conned, so that they don't get swamped by this sea of lies, this ocean of deceit, which is just manipulating people and turning the world upside down. So that's the end of my sermon. Back to you, Artem, and I'll be very fascinated by any comments or any questions or any thoughts around your own practices.
This is incredible. We have a lot of appreciation coming in for your another view on story. And actually, thanks to you, I've recently started listening to Story Paradox, and I find it really interesting how Jonathan talks about swaying with the story. I haven't completed it yet, so no spoilers.
Right.
We have a question coming from Howard, and it's a great question, so let me read it out loud. Can you give us some examples of how you, as a story practitioner who is wise, deconstruct the story as inherently good story so that you start off an engagement from a position somewhat different rather than here comes the story of amazing la-di-da?
Well, part of the question I've got, and it's probably a book I'm in the middle of writing, is if Artem, you were telling me a story, the question in my mind is, where are you coming from? And where do you want me to go? So the story may have an intention that may be different from yours, but a story, I want to treat the story as a distinct object of it's wanting something from me, and it's not innocent. I presume no story is innocent, even a fairy tale. I mean, the feminists get hold of the story of Cinderella and they pull it apart and say, you think that's a fairy tale? My goodness, it's not a fairy tale. So I don't treat any story as innocent. And I'm not cynical, but I am skeptical. So that when the general at the Pentagon says to Congress, we need $100 billion more in tanks and guns and weapons. And I'm not going to say, wow, General, that's really concerning because China and all these other threats. I'm going to say, where is he coming from? He's a general at the Pentagon. Of course he's going to say that. This is just where he's coming from, that's the story he produces. I'm not going to take it seriously in terms of his intention is for me to pass the budget and get more budget for his interest and his Pentagon and whatever. It's not to say that it might not be necessarily be not true, but for many years, like I worked on the streets with the homeless, and they're the best storytellers in the world. They'll come up to me on the street and tell me a sad story. They don't want me to help them. They want me to give them money so they can go and buy more drugs or have more, whatever is their medicine that keeps them alive. So it's like a story is positioning me. It's coming from a position and it's wanting me to go to a position that'll affect the way I believe and the way I choose. So no story is innocent. It's a weapon. Someone is using it to position me. And when I start to ask the question about position, then story as an instrument of power is revealed. I start to see, oh, hang on, something else is going on here. Someone's just not telling me about this health insurance that I should buy. Somebody, and then given that marketing has taken over the storytelling world, I don't know, I just think that tell a story that some of the best stories don't want anything from me. They confuse me. They mix up the good and the bad. They kind of, what is Tolstoy? He wrote War and Peace. What does he want? Some of them are much more complicated stories than I think the stories we tell. But I don't know whether that answered the question. But there is I have principles of narrative ethics that if people were interested in, I could send them, because we've had to work on this to say, you tell me a story, and even whether it's not true or true, I have a sort of bullshit detecting principle around whether I want to accept it or not.
Okay. Paul, I think that's a great question. And to sum it up, being aware of where the story is trying to position you is a great consciousness method of at least trying to be aware of its influence, which we could, I guess, take away. And there is a question from Yanis exactly on the point of power, and we have the time to answer it. So he's asking, Paul, thinking of Michael White's view on the notion of failure as refusal to the requirements of modern power, what could our failures teach us?
Well, I mean, again, Lincoln's quote, I think failure is, to me, the stimulus of innovation. I mean, I think our operating assumptions, it's almost like, when your computer crashes and you lose everything, and then you have to start again. And then when you start again, you have to go through what was useful and what wasn't useful. I think failure is it's painful as ever, but I think our imaginations get stifled and stale because story is like a gutter that water flows down. And the deeper, the more that story is told about achievement being success and prosperity and growth, this gutter is getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it's almost impossible not to fall into it. So when we run aground, when we find ourselves, mixing my metaphors on a deserted island, there's an energy about starting again. It's a different energy from having to repair something. You got to start again. Or, what's it, Apollo 11? They had to, the mission capsule was failing and they couldn't fix it. Well, they had to, what have we got here? Let's reinvent something here with the materials that we've got to hand. So I think embracing failure is the seed of innovation. I don't think we should be so afraid of failure.
Just to make the interpreter catch up with us.
Yeah, sure.
Lovely. Paul, this is great. And we have one more question coming from Anna, but we are behind the timing. So I'm going to ask you, if I may, to stay and type in something for her. Sure. A great question to you about the important story of fail. But as a tradition goes, I wanted to hear it from you, the heretic and the practitioner. So you coming to this conference, despite whatever might other people say, for me, it proves that people can connect over the borders for a greater cause. Mm-hmm. So from a skeptic and a wise storyteller, what other meaning would you like to inspire people about so we all together can live in a place with more stories? More bridges.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an adage that I teach and often have to remind myself, and it's this. It's not the story you listen to, it's the story you listen through. And if that is the case, that we're always listening to stories through stories, there's always a bigger story that informs the meaning of the little story. And so somehow in terms of change practice, I'll often, in my work, I've been trying to change the little story, and it isn't going to work. Somehow I have to change the listening, because sometimes it's the same story. It doesn't have to change. What has to change is the way I hear it. It's not the story I listen to, it's the story I listen through. And pulling out what is the story I'm listening through, that becomes the seed of change. And one of the, as I said, the story that we have about story is one of the lenses that I think needs to change.
I'm so excited that I forgot to unmute myself. Paul, this was sensational. All those fires, and it's a hint to our participants, all those fires are to you. Thank you for a refreshing and really a perspective that we needed here, I guess. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thanks, Artem. Thank you very much. All the best to everybody. Thank you.
Thank you. Different perspectives, eh? But we are moving on, and we have another person with a fresh perspective who is actually was mentioned by Paul as a teacher and as a friend.